Welcome to Strategy Speaks, the official podcast of the Centre for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. I'm your host, Daniel Fiott, and this 10th episode, I'm really pleased and delighted to welcome Professor Stephan Frühling for a discussion about Australia's defence strategy and Australia's approaches to deterrence. Stephan is based at the Australian National University as part of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. As our listeners may already know, Stephan is also widely published on Australian strategy and defence studies and policy, as well as, of course, NATO and alliance studies more generally. Welcome to the podcast, Stephan.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Stephan, I wonder if I could ask you our first question, which is to essentially provide our listeners with an overview of how Australia's defence strategy has evolved over the past few years.
That's a good question. And I mean, if you look at Australian policy over the last 10 years, I think like Western European countries, as we came out of Afghanistan, there was a period where we were really not quite certain what would come after. And for us, it was kind of the 2016 white paper that said it's not going to be COIN anymore. It's not going to be counterterrorism or HDR and so on. It's going to be like great power conflict that is likely going to be the main kind of focus for our defense policy and over the next decades. But it did so in a context where there was no real great urgency. I mean, we had obviously Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China starting to build islands in the South China Sea. But I mean, both of those things are an awfully long way away from Australia still. So the sense of urgency that you saw in Europe after 2016 didn't really hit us yet. And that changed around kind of like 2018, 2019, 2020. And there's probably a few reasons for that. I mean, the changes to China under Xi Jinping were becoming more clear, that it was a very different China from what was before. The scale of China's military buildup really started to kind of like sink in. We saw some Chinese interest in getting military access in our backyard, and particularly in the Solomon Islands, and that certainly, focused minds here in Canberra. And then perhaps most importantly, China's economic coercion of Australia. When our Prime Minister called at the WHO for an international investigation of the origins of COVID, that led to kind of like China, putting up the shutters and essentially cutting us out of anything other than iron ore and thermal coal markets in China. And it's around that time that you saw obviously AUKUS as probably the most prominent and visible, if you like, change to our defense policy. But I think there's another three or so that happened in parallel. One of them is Australia's own defense policy and posture. So in the 2020 Defense Strategic Update, there was a distinct sense of shifting from the long term to greater improvements within the decades. So, increasing ammunition stocks, rebuilding our long-range strike arsenal, including, acquiring SM-6, Tomahawk, those kinds of things, where we really hadn't invested in for decades. And that was then continued in the 2024 National Defense Strategy and a previous review on which that was based, which refocused the ADF and Army in particular on what we call littoral warfare. So a combination of land-based anti-ship missiles and air defense with light and medium amphibious vessels, so that we can deploy army into the islands to our north, and if you like, create our own version of an anti-access area denial screen in Australia's own approaches. And along with that kind of like came an implicit embrace of deterrence since about 2020 in our defense policy, and more specifically, deterrence by denial, and in the latest iteration of our national strategy. And that's kind of like linked to this operational posture of denial in our own approaches. And then the second area, or third, if you include AUKUS in that as well, is increased cooperation in our alliance with the US. So you may know that back in 2012, President Obama came to Australia. Gave a very prominent speech in Parliament here, and as part of that, Australia agreed on, while he was in Canberra, on the so-called force posture initiative with the US, and essentially that was about increasing American land, air, naval deployments to Australia. And in the context of significant problems that the Americans were having at the time with the Japanese about Marines in Okinawa. So what came out of that was rotational deployments of the Marines for training in our Northern Territory dry season up in Darwin. Nothing much really happened in the naval and airspace for many years. And essentially, at the time, we saw this force posture cooperation as a bit of a political support to Obama's pivot to Asia, not really as a strategic move, if you like, or something that would really affect our defense policy and defense posture. And that really changed in around that time as well, around 2019. So suddenly it became politically possible to accept US bomber rotations, and they've been regular visitors here to Australia now, both B-2s and B-52s. Increased American ship visits. The Americans are spending not inconsiderable sums on fuel and ammunition storages on our bases. We're expanding base Tyndall to host B-52s and so on and so forth. So essentially, Australia is now finally willing to and open again to fulfill that geographic role that we also fulfilled in the Second World War, as the southern base area for U.S. long-range operations into the Western Pacific, even if the main U.S. operations will still come from on the west out of Hawaii and over Guam. And then the third thing that kind of changed in those years as well is what we call the so-called Pacific step up here. So essentially, and a whole of government, whole of nation to some extent effort to counter Chinese influence in the Southwest Pacific. So if you like Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and a lot of these other smaller countries in Melanesia and Polynesia. And there's a real sense that we kind of as the regional superpower in many ways, certainly economic superpower, dropped the ball in foreign affairs, aid, defense, focus, and so on, as we were all kind of active in the Middle East. And that opened a gap that China has been very happy to fill diplomatically and economically, and in some areas also in terms of security cooperation. And that certainly raises a lot of concerns for us in terms of the quality for local governance, but also militarily, insofar as China was seeking to gain agreements with Vanuatu and the Solomons, which included military access rights. And so since about 2020, we've seen a very significant step up in investment in terms of government attention and investment again in those relationships. That's together with the US, with Japan, with New Zealand, also with the EU, which has also stepped up in this space. That includes military presence and training efforts and so on, but that's actually only a small part of it. A lot of this is about direct funding for things like regional police colleges, new subsea communications cables, so that they'll be laid by us, not by the Chinese. The Falipili Union with Tuvalu, which essentially, Tuvalu has kind of subordinated its foreign and defense policy to Australia in return for ultimately, a guarantee for rehoming the Tuvaluan population once those islands get affected by climate change. And I mean, most recently, and it kind of shows you that, this really is competition. We've agreed to spend $600 million over 10 years to build an Australian rugby union team in PNG, which is a very popular sport up there, who are playing in the Australian League. And as part of that, it's very explicit that, that funding will be withdrawn if PNG signs a security agreement with China. So in that sense, we are now playing competition in a fairly direct way. So if you take a half glass full approach, we certainly have embraced competition and decided to compete, at least in some of those areas. And on the other hand, I do think there's also a half glass empty view, in the sense that there's still no real new money for defense. We've got a 3 to 4% GDP defense policy that we're trying to buy on 2% of GDP. And so we're still spending less on defense than we did in the 1980s. Public opinion saw a direct shift and very, very significant shift around 2018 to see China much more as a security threat to Australia. And that's now baked in and hasn't changed. But at the same time, as government has kind of like worked to reopen markets with China, they've been much more reluctant again to kind of like calling out China as the key security threat in our region. They often phrase now, the central challenge that is framing us as competition between US and China, as if we're kind of like, an innocent bystander and disinterested bystander. So in that sense, urgency still remains lacking in practice. And I think that if you want to take your European analogy, we're probably where Europe was after 2014. If you think about 2016 Wales Summit, and it seemed like a big change at the time, and in hindsight, it wasn't quite enough. And I think that that's probably a good description of where Australia mentally is on a lot of these issues at the moment.
Thanks, Stephan. That was a great opening to our conversation and really comprehensive in terms of how Australia has changed. And as you rightfully said at the end of your response there, maybe some of the ways in which Australia hasn't changed or hasn't caught up with the game. And I very much appreciate your analogy to Australia being like Europe in 2014. I think that will hit our listeners very forcefully indeed. In your opening response as well, I think you of course mentioned very rightly the increasing threat from China and how that's animating, I think, shifts in Australian thinking. And we'll get back to China, I think, a little bit later in the episode. But I first wanted to maybe ask you, because that seems like one of the pressing issues at the moment, and you mentioned that as well, about the close relationship with the United States, right? And of course, we see now in the US, only in a matter of days, actually, after this recording of this episode, that Donald Trump will become president for the second time, right? So I'm really wondering how you think maybe possible shifts in the transatlantic alliance under the next Trump administration and some of the messaging that's coming out from the incoming team, how you think that will actually affect Australia's defense policy and strategy?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And I think that, I'm always very reluctant to kind of speculate what's going to happen under Trump, because I do think that the one thing that we do know from the first administration is that he will be good for surprises. And I think there's very little reason to think that, the same is not going to be true again. I do think, though, that, there is probably a sense where that Asian countries are a bit more relaxed about Trump this time around than Europe. If you go back to Trump, the first Trump administration, and his comments before and in the first few months, a lot of his kind of like anger at the time seemed to be directed at Japan and South Korea in particular, making South Korea pay for American troops out there and so on. That's not something that we're hearing much at the moment. It seems to be his focus is a lot more on Europe in that sense. I think there's also a sense that Asian countries, in Australia in particular, managed actually to build fairly good relationships ultimately with Trump in the first administration. So, Australia, for example, we were one of the few, if not the only country that kind of got an exemption from his tariffs, largely because the US had a trade a surplus with us, and one of the few countries. And that was ultimately the outcome of a lot of investment into that relationship, both with Trump personally and with people in his administration. But how much we can take that as indication as to what will happen, I'm a bit skeptical. And I do think that a lot of what will happen in the transatlantic relationship may or may not can be significant, depending on whether what will happen will be seen as an indication of his attitude to allies in general, or whether it's a European specific issue. And I think that the jury is still out on that, I think. Certainly, I do think that we're reasonably happy with, the admin appointments that we've seen so far. At least if you think about, Marco Rubio and the new national security advisor and so on, they're fairly hawkish on China. They're very supportive of Australia and other Indo-Pacific allies. So in that sense, we take some comfort from that, whether rightly or wrongly. And a lot of the question will also be, how will Europe react to whatever pressures will arise in that transatlantic relationship. Because, I mean, you could imagine a future where part of a new, if you like, political transatlantic bargain will also be a greater European engagement in the Indo-Pacific, if that is something that Trump, is worried about, and wants to focus about, and that might actually lead to, greater European engagement in our region, which certainly would be helpful. So I do think that there's a wide range of futures, some of which are actually quite good for Indo-Pacific allies, some of which are quite horrible. But where we're going to end up with is anybody's guess.
Thanks, Stephan, for that answer. And yes, I guess we're in a kind of wait and see moment. Things will become clearer with the incoming Trump administration very, very soon. If possible, I'd like to circle back to what you were saying earlier about China and China's coercive presence in the Indo-Pacific, and how that's animating in many ways Australia's defense posture, but also the way it engages in competitive strategies in the region. You're also familiar, of course, with discussions that are happening in Europe about deterrence, and deterrence as a concept has gained a lot more attention since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course. But today there also seems to be a kind of critical debate about what deterrence really means in practice beyond the kind of nuclear dimension. Right. So I wondered also if you could pick up maybe, how are Australian conversations and conceptions of deterrence evolving in light of China's coercive presence in the Indo-Pacific?
Now, that is a very good question. And I think that it's important to realize that Australians' considerations on this are still very nascent. And I think the jury is still out whether deterrence is actually really a useful concept for Australia to think about, certainly its own national posture. And I think it's important, by way of background, to highlight that Australia has very little history of deterrence. Deterrence really was not a major feature of our defense policy ever, really. Even during the Cold War, we were obviously part of SEATO in the 50s and 60s, but even which kind of was part of global deterrence, if you like. But in practice, I guess our focus was on, defending South Vietnam and, counter coercion and so on, where deterrence didn't really kind of like fit kind of like the types of threats that we were facing even in those years, quite unlike Europe. And after Vietnam, Australia really kind of like took a time out from the Cold War in military terms. We focused on our region. So again, we were never part of an alliance that had deterrence at its core. So if you like, deployments for deterrence, the whole pole mill apparatus that comes developed in many alliances around the management of deterrence, those kinds of things, just we have no experience with. And the same goes for nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, there was, realization that the American satellite stations here in Australia would probably be a target for Soviet nuclear attack. But we're not. Other than that, we've never been threatened by a nuclear power, and we've never really been threatened in any existential way. So extended nuclear deterrence for us has always been a very theoretical, abstract, academic concept, never something that really arose as something of policy relevance. If you think about it, if you think about Spain or Portugal or so, it's like there's probably a lot more abstract, theoretical kind of like view of how important nuclear deterrence is in national defense policy than if you're Germany during the Cold War or Poland today. And so in that sense, if NATO talked about, rebuilding the nuclear queue and rediscovering deterrence, well, we have to build it from the ground up. And I think that that's important to kind of keep in mind. So when our defense update in 2020 kind of embraced the term deterrence, it was not sign of some kind of like coherent intellectual policy construct that was behind that. It was more the starting gun for us to start to think through what that actually means in practice, than the other way around. And that still is very much work in progress. So I think that there are a number of senses that have developed over the years since. One is that Australia can and should do more to enable US deterrence. And this is, I guess, connecting with the Force Posture Initiative, hosting US forces And to some extent, we're using the term multilateral deterrence for that. But certainly Australia is an enabler of ultimately American deterrence. I think that there's a broader sense of that term multilateral deterrence, though, than perhaps if you took it into the European context, because we obviously don't have a NATO, we don't have red lines. Obviously there's a lot. Taiwan is the central contingency that a lot of we're worried about. But even the U.S. maintains a policy of strategic ambiguity about what its commitments to Taiwan actually are. And if you're deliberately ambiguous about your commitments, it's very hard to build a deterrence kind of like framework on top of that, let alone if you're an ally who kind of like is only, if you like, one step removed. So I think that use of the term multilateral deterrence has connotations that are a lot more diplomatic, economic, and so on, about raising uncertainty about how broad the global reaction will be, raising uncertainty about Chinese ability to contain the economic costs of starting a major crisis, not just military costs, and so on and so forth. And then our national policy talks about deterrence by denial, but the origins of that are really in a more operational concept of denial in our own maritime approaches and the approaches to the Australian continent, and how that operational concept of denial, which for a major conflict makes a lot of sense, how you would leverage that into deterrence, I think is something which is much more vague and fuzzy, and where a lot of work now needs to be done and is being done, and thinking about what that might mean in terms of signaling, deployments, and so on, and whether it actually is a useful concept in the first place. Because a lot of the situations that we are worried about, certainly in our own patch of the world, aren't necessarily conducive to deterrence. For example, that specter of a Chinese military base in the Southwest Pacific. Deterrence probably doesn't do a lot in terms of preventing that. That's a task for diplomatic relations, and if you like, our relations, rebuilding our relations with the Southwest Pacific. And if they manage to establish that, well, deterrence is not going to do much in terms of addressing the operational challenges that would come from that. So I do think that deterrence probably will always remain a more kind of like fuzzy, broader strategic political concept in that sense than in the NATO context, where you have clear lines on if the Russians stay on the right hand of the side of the line, then deterrence works.
And I'm picking up on some of the key words that you were using there about ambiguity, fuzziness, maybe over theoretical at this stage. But I think you also remarked, even in your first response to the question, which was the sense of urgency now that's being felt around some of these important questions. So it's very interesting to see where Australia takes that particular debate on deterrence. Also, in your response as well, you directly referred to the Force Posture Initiative, and you've also written about United States, Australia force posture cooperation, right? With the implication being, I think, from your writings that Australia is one of the only viable strategic locations for force deployments in Southeast Asia. And you've already referred to that, I think, in passing in this episode. You've also argued, I think, in some of your writings as well, that Australia's location, its geographical location as well, also has some kind of strategic significance for Europeans too. And especially there, I think, as you've said, or written rather, that as Europeans are increasing their military presence and deployments also to the Indo-Pacific, there is at least a window here into thinking about how force posture might affect Europe, or might be of interest to the Europeans as they expand their interest in the Indo-Pacific. I wonder, for the benefit of our listeners, whether or not you could unpack some of these ideas a little further.
Yeah, thank you. And certainly those are things that I've kind of touched on in a recent Carnegie paper on US-Australia force posture cooperation. And I think that there is a very interesting development in the sense that over the last few years, Europeans have kind of dipped their toes in the water in terms of Indo-Pacific deployments. We've seen from year to year an increase in naval deployments, increase also in particular in air deployments. to regional exercises. I mean, if you go back 10, 15, or 15 years or so, I mean, there were essentially no Europeans showing up to regional exercises here. These days, I think last year, our Pitch Black, our main air defense air exercise here in the Northern Territory, I think there were about 44 or so European planes participating, which I guess, I mean, that's a long way from Europe and quite a considerable effort. And I think that there is a sense that I think Europeans have probably raised expectations by and certainly sent signals that they may or may not have been that may or may not have been the intention to send, but whatever the case is, if it's normalized that there is a quite significant European presence for regular exercises in the region, I think that there will be an expectation that Europe will demonstrate its concern about a crisis in the region by sending forces. Or certainly if we now had a major crisis over Taiwan, for example, and Europeans wouldn't send any forces when they've demonstrated the capacity to send squadron-sized deployments on a regular basis, not sending anything would be a signal in its own right in that situation. And I think that that's not something that I think Australia and the US have paid a huge amount of attention to. I'm not sure that Europeans have really kind of paid that much attention to the situation that they're now finding themselves in that regard. But I think that kind of does present some opportunities, and in particular for Australia. I mean, Australia has to think through what is our role in multilateral and in US deterrence. Traditionally, we have, as I said, thought about our role as hosting US long-range strike forces. That raises a whole bunch of issues. I mean, in terms of, will those be conventional forces or nuclear forces? Are we going to kind of host US B-52s that might fly, attacks against the Chinese mainland and so on? I mean, so vertical escalation raises a whole host of political questions that are quite difficult. I think kind of if you think about Australia, though, as facilitating horizontal escalation, and if you complicating Chinese assumptions by drawing in additional countries into a reaction to regional crisis, that's a lot more politically palatable. And in that context, I think Australia has opportunities and is attractive and of relevance for Europe, because if you imagine a major crisis over Taiwan and Europe wanted to send forces, limited forces, but still, in the regional context, significant forces to demonstrate its commitment, there aren't that many places that they can go, in particular air deployments. I mean, you can go to Alaska, but even Alaska, I think, the Americans are probably going to take up all the ramp space, and I'm not sure that they're going to be too keen for, a few Europeans, in particular if they're, sending Eurofighters or so with their own logistics chains and so on, you're more likely to get in the way. And that's certainly the case in Guam and Okinawa, where you're also going to be in the line of fire, much in the line of fire. So I think that Northern Australia, for political and operational reasons, is probably the kind of sweet spot where you might want to deploy forces to demonstrate your commitment and support to the US and Indo-Pacific allies without necessarily kind of being in a position where you're going to be involved in conflict immediately if that should break out. And Australia would have, a lot of interest in receiving even small numbers of European forces, because Australia is a very big place and our Air Force in the scheme of things is very small. So, a squadron of Eurofighters is not going to make much difference in the North Asian fight, but it would certainly make a big difference for our Air Force. And I think that is something that I think could well be developed as a cooperation between the US, Europe, and Australia, and in very practical and I think feasible ways that you could imagine. For example, the next 2026 Pitch Black. Why not, for example, build a multilateral air bridge between Europe and Northern Australia and actually test and demonstrate the ability to deploy fighter and transport aircraft between Europe and Northern Australia in a way that would be more relevant and indicative or representative of a crisis than these kind of long drawn out deployments with lots of diplomatically motivated stops on the way that we've seen in the past. And certainly, a European-supported air bridge between Europe and Northern Australia would be a meaningful cooperation that would be of use for the Americans as well, as a alternative to a Trans-Pacific air bridge. So I think that would be a meaningful cooperation that is certainly, I think, within the scope of Europe to support. And in naval deployments, there's probably other examples. For example, testing. We have seen the Americans test improvised remunitioning of some of their ships in Northern Australia. Why not, for example, test munitioning of European vessels in Northern Australia? And it's something that could well be integrated into the kinds of deployments and the scale of the deployments that we've seen over the last few years and that have become normalized now. But I would just do that little bit more to demonstrate that those deployments can also assume a more operational relevance if Europe desires, rather than have the very deliberately purely diplomatic kind of tone to them that we've seen in the last few years.
Thanks, Stephan. I think that's a really great way to round off our discussion here today by stressing, in fact, the European, not only European engagement in the Indo-Pacific, but definitely moving beyond the purely diplomatic approach to that engagement, and also starting to think through some of the operational dimensions of that engagement. And you have also, I think, usefully stressed the importance of Australia's geopolitical location within the Indo-Pacific and its role more generally in that region. So I want to thank you, Stephan, for engaging with us on quite a wide-ranging discussion about Australian conceptions of deterrence, shifts in its defence policy, and how it's going to act in the coming weeks, months and years with some of its core partners. Thanks, Stephan, and please, to our listeners, do join us for the next episode. Thank you.